Well, good morning, all. Good to see you all here. C.S. Lewis famously said, Jesus Christ is either Lord, or he's a lunatic, or he's just a liar. But he can't be both or all three of any of those. He's either Lord, he is who he says he is, or he's a complete lunatic. He's lost his mind, or he's just deceitful or lying. This is the full quote from C.S. Lewis about Jesus. He says, I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. They say things like, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. This is one of the things we cannot say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall flat at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being merely a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. I say this by way of a preface for the beginning of this gospel. It says, the Jews murmured among themselves. Murmuring is a term that comes up often in the Old Testament, always with negative connotations. You know, if you're a father and mother of your family, maybe you have some kids, and when your kids start murmuring, it's like a quiet, subtle revolt. It's like, so Jesus is speaking, and the Jews who are hearing his teaching are murmuring among themselves. Why? They're trying to decipher, how can this man say he is, I am the bread that came down from heaven? A radical claim. And they're trying to understand, with clenched teeth, we could almost say, like, well, Joseph is his father, Mary was his mother, we have seen him, we saw him in diapers. They're trying to understand how he could, either he's a lunatic, he's out of his mind. Is he lying? Could he possibly be telling the truth? And this was the greatest aspect of the murmuring of the Jews about Jesus when Jesus was teaching about him being the bread that came down from heaven. Now, this is, of course, all talking about the Eucharist, but perhaps just a few contextual points about the bread that came down from heaven. We won't go through this super long, but remember Adam and Eve in the garden? And after they sinned, when God, a good father, gave Adam and Eve certain tasks, he said to Eve, like, you will bear children, and it will be painful. And to Adam, you will toil and sweat by your brow to make bread. And so it's particularly the father of the family that he would break the bread. This is true with even like Jewish Sabbaths today. The father of the family would take the bread, symbolizing the sweat of his brow as the head of the family, and he would break it. Like some of us celebrate like Lord's Days. Remember the Lord's Day prayers? It's always the leader of the house that takes the bread into their hands and first breaks it before anyone else. The great insight into Scripture about this is in that tradition of the Jews, when the father of the family would break bread, then he would pass it around, and it would actually be a sharing in the Father's heart. The little pieces of the bread would symbolize his heart. Even the word companion literally means, in two Latin words, one who breaks bread with another and shares something very deeply. So, added to this, or coupled with this always stemmed from the Exodus, when the Israelites, after they fell away with Adam and Eve's sin and were propelled into the desert to wander around looking for the promised land, God saw their hunger, their great needs, and out of the mercy of God, he sent them manna from heaven. Manna and the Jews, like you can read about this in Exodus and Deuteronomy, they said it was like coriander seeds. Now, I'm not a cook, but I know what coriander seeds are. Very small seeds, and it said like it would sit upon, like every morning, like the dewfall, it would sit on the tops of plants. And the Jews would gather it up and kind of mush it together to make like a sort of wheat. And then that's how they would make their bread that they would use for Lord's Day. All of this is in the background immediately of the Jewish mindset. When Jesus said, unlike your ancestors who ate the bread and died, just mere mortal flesh, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. And then Jesus says, whoever eats this bread will live forever. And that bread is my flesh. And that was the context for the murmuring. Either he's a liar, or he's out of his mind, he's a lunatic, or he's the Lord. He cannot be a couple of those together, or merely a great teacher. He has to be one of those. This is the great radicality at every Mass. And all the words of institution carry the same in the sense of, you'll hear me this morning say, Jesus took bread. He took it and he broke it and he gave it to them. He is the living bread that came down from heaven. He's the bread, which means he's the heart of the Father. And the heart of the Father is being broken and given to his sons and daughters to eat. It's especially in the context of why would God do this? Well, we call the Eucharist many things, but it's often called food for the journey. Life is hard. Did you catch the first reading? It's really kind of in your face. Elijah went a day's journey into the desert. He was running from the worst queen of Israel in the whole history of Israel. She wanted to kill him for many reasons. So he's escaping from her. He came to a broom tree and sat beneath it and prayed for death, saying, Lord, this is enough. Take my life. Life can get kind of fatiguing at times. In the ups and downs of life, God, as the good Father, wants to feed his children. And throughout the Old Testament, it was the food of bread. The Father on Lord's Day would break the bread and give it to them. But then the new covenant is not mere bread. It's flesh of the Father's own heart. And that is Jesus at every Eucharist. Again, we can never get used to this teaching. Imagine that if at every Mass, the priest gave out 10 $100 bills or $1,000 to every person that came at every Mass. Every Mass. We'd be like, yeah, yes, please. I might even come to Mass more than once a day. Not to mention during the week. What is money going to give us? Well, it's going to give us perhaps a little more enhancement to our time here on earth, our journey through life, make our time a little easier perhaps. Jesus is not giving out that, but something far deeper, far greater. He says, unlike your ancestors who ate that partial bread and still died, this is the bread that came down from heaven so that whoever eats of it will live forever. Which is why in the early church, one of the great terms or terminology for the Eucharist was, especially by St. Ignatius in the early century, the medicine or food of immortality, they would call it. This is why we want to come up with great reverence and faith and have a Eucharistic spirituality, which means Sunday is not the last day of the week or the tail end of the weekend. I mean, I know it kind of is for a lot of Americans. It's actually the first day of the week. It's supposed to be the highest priority of our whole life. Think about that. Like even the way we think about our mindsets, like we come to Friday, it's like, oh, thank heavens. Thank God it's Friday. And then Saturday's kind of nice. And then by the time Saturday night hits, we're like, oh, crap, I only have one more day to kind of not go to work. And then Sunday hits, we're like, oh, gosh, I've got to go to Mass. And the mentality is oftentimes we treat the Eucharist and the worship of God almost as like, well, I just got to do this. But for the Christian, it actually should be the other way around. It's the source from which all our life comes. It's the bread that keeps me going. It's the food for the journey. But it's also the summit. It's what we actually are like saying, that's where I meet God. That's the top of the mountain. It doesn't get any closer. And it's true, as Catholics, the greatest intimacy we could ever have in this life with God is in the moment and the moments following receiving the Holy Eucharist into our person. We are receiving the living heartbeat of the Father in the flesh of Jesus. I don't know if you know this, but there are many persons, many saints, but also many non-saints that are not yet made saints that lived exclusively on the Eucharist for years. Have you heard of any of these people? I will just give you a little smattering of them. St. Angela of Foligno, 1248, long time ago. She lived on nothing but that little host for 12 years. And we might scoff at the first reading when Elijah, after he ate that bread and he walked through the desert for 40 days, like, it's not very scientific, 40 days on bread. It has happened. It happened to St. Angela Foligno. She died in 1310, and it was documented that for 12 years, only the Eucharist, nothing else. St. Catherine of Siena, she died at the age of 33. She was known to have lived almost 25 years, only on the Eucharist. Great doctor of the church. St. Lidwana of Holland, never heard of her until this morning, if I'm honest. 19 years until her death in 1433, she lived exclusively on the Eucharist. She saw it as the real food for the journey. Alexandrina da Costa, not yet a saint, but she died only in 1955. The last 3 whole years of her life, documented by many doctors, only the host. Now, this is not to say that you should try this. I'm merely saying Jesus is either Lord, or he's a lunatic, or he's a liar. And when Jesus Christ, as Lord, says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Everyone who eats of this bread, which is my flesh, will live forever. He's telling the truth. It's the real thing. And as Catholics, my hope, and the hope of the church, is that we would see the Eucharist, and especially Sunday worship, as both the source from which all our life comes. I'm drawing my life from the Eucharist. And it's also the summit. It's like the top of the mountain. I want to come to the worship of God with great faith and reverence. It's such a powerful thing here at St. Lawrence and in many. Did you know that the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis has more adoration chapels than any other diocese in the country? I really think this is why the Lord has blessed. We're almost spoiled to death in the Archdiocese with so many good things and movements and very holy people. And I really think in part because here in the Twin Cities, the Eucharist is so central to us. The Eucharistic Congress that happened in Indianapolis this past July. Do you know the most number of people from one place that went there? St. Paul and Minneapolis. There was more people from St. Paul, Minneapolis, of the 50,000 that came than anywhere else, any other diocese. There's so many riches here, and we only want to grow with great gratitude, not to be prideful, like, hey, we're the best. Do we have a Eucharistic spirituality? Do we see our life as saying, like, the Eucharist is my food? It is the source from which I'm drawing my life. Reception of the Eucharist. Getting ready for worthy reception. Repenting of my sins so that I can have communion with the heart of Jesus. That's why many people, again, just some practical things, that's why I say it every Mass, every Sunday, like there's always some non-Catholics that we have among us. We're so glad you're here. But Holy Communion not only is the flesh of Jesus, but it is, and when we receive it, it's only for those who hold in unity the whole teaching of the Catholic faith. So it's not possible for non-Catholics to receive Holy Communion because it's not merely bread. It's not just a sign of hospitality. When we're receiving the Eucharist, we're saying, yes, I believe that Jesus is Lord. This is the flesh of Jesus, and not merely a sign or a symbol. And everything else that Jesus speaks about in the church is all true as well. So we want to come forward with, like, as a priest, I've said this before, but we never want to get used to this. The power that Jesus Christ is giving us, not merely more money at every Mass. He's giving us the heart of the Father. He is the heart of the Father. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Everyone who eats this bread will live forever